this is Dr. Jung was typically very acerbic in some letters, and I'm going to read one to you a little later. But I want to focus on this Dorothy Thompson for a moment. And so he's referring to this Ezra Pound dust up, and he said, "It's a pleasure to receive a letter." The letter of a normally intelligent person to contrast to the evil flood of idiotic and malevolent insinuations I seem to have released in the USA. Um, I don't think he even knew anything about the giving of the word Ezra Pound, and I, I honestly don't know much about Ezra Pound. He went to Hamilton College. He said he can't write a book about the psychological intricacies, but he says I will try to be simple. A political situation is the manifestation of a parallel psychological problem in millions of individuals. This problem is largely unconscious, which makes it a particularly dangerous one. It consists of a conflict between a conscious, ethical, religious, philosophical, social, political, and psychological standpoint and an unconscious one, which is characterized by the same aspects but represented in a lower, i.e., more archaic form. Instead of high Christian ethics, the laws of the herd, suppression of individual responsibility, and submission to the tribal chief, totalitarian ethics. Um, so, does anybody want to comment on that much so far? Um,
I don't
no? Okay, let me keep going then. Instead of religion, superstitious belief in an ad hoc doctrine of truth, instead of philosophy, a low grade doctrinary system which rationalizes the appetites of the herd, instead of a differentiated social organization, a meaningless, chaotic agglomeration of uprooted individuals kept under by sheer force and terror and blindfolded by appropriate lies, instead of a constructive use of political power with the aim of attaining an equilibrium of freely developing forces, a destructive tendency to extend suppression over the whole world through attaining mere superiority of power. Instead of psychology, use of psychological means to extinguish the individual spark and to uh, of uh, inhibit the development of consciousness and intelligence. Um, and one of the things he had said in volume 10, which is about civilization and transition, is that the one hopeful thing he saw was that the Western democracies were um, full of dissension, and he regarded dissension as a good thing because it meant that we were thinking and working things out. And and so, one of the things that I think is significant here is um, the aim of attaining an equilibrium of freely developing forces. And of course, in the world today, we have, um, notwithstanding anything that's going on in the United States, we have so many cultures that have um, broken down. They're literally full of holes. I actually wrote an article at one point called "Culture Pot Full of Holes," and it's basically about Humpty Dumpty. You build up your culture and everything is fine, but when Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall, then all the king's horses and all the king's men can't put it back together again. And and so we have, especially the Muslim cultures, that are just opened up. Um, Things that we developed over 500 years, let's say, they've had to deal with psychologically in 20. And and they're still having to deal with it. And it's a big thing. You find this conflict in nearly every citizen of any Western nation, but one is mostly unconscious of it. In Russia, which has always been a barbarous country, I don't know where he gets that. I mean, Russia was also a civilized country fairly well, too. The unconscious half of the conflict has reached the surface and has replaced civilized consciousness. Okay, so now he's referring to the Soviet Union. That is what we fear might happen to ourselves too. We are afraid of this schizophrenia all the more since Germany has clearly demonstrated that even a civilized community can be seized by such a mental catastrophe as it were overnight, which proves my point. Thus, we've got to realize one, we are not immune. Number two, the destructive powers are right there in ourselves. Um, Three, the more unconscious they are, the more dangerous. Four, we are threatened from within as well as from without. Five, we cannot destroy the enemy by force. We should not even try to overcome Russia because we would destroy ourselves, since Russia is, as it were, identical with our unconscious, which, which contains our instincts and all the germs of our future development. I thought that was,
That'd be interesting to hear you talk about that a little more, because I don't grasp that right off. I don't quite
well, I think that, I mean, as an artist, I think you would agree that, you know, insight about what you should paint or what have you comes from an instinctual or an unconscious place in most cases. Um, but if you're going to be unique as an artist, it has to come from within, from your unconscious.
Well, it means to me is that uh, Russia's, I don't know whether he's talking like in a shadow or not, but it makes it sound like Russia is all of it is our unconscious. So it's and since everything we're conscious of is grounded in the unconscious,
Right.
then what does that mean exactly to say they are our unconscious? Because then that means we need, if we want to understand ourselves, we need to look at Russia.
Well, we need to understand that that could have been us. Okay, if you were living
Yeah,
under Stalin,
but it's a tension. It's a tension that'll never resolve. It sounds like because
yeah,
well, if you're talking Stalin and Lenin and that crew,
right.
and Mao Zedong and every Mussolini, I don't know. I'm hoping
I mean,
that's
we
just
all have to
another era.
examine ourselves on this.
Yeah,
I mean, he's making the assertion. I'm not saying he's absolutely right or
oh
absolutely
no, I'm
wrong,
just
but
trying
it's
to
very
understand what he was saying.
interesting.
I
And
got to think about when he was living too.
yeah, I mean, this was 1949, so Stalin was at the height of the 20 million person purge that he did in the Soviet Union. He died in 54. So
He
uh,
was getting ready to do it again.
now, I mean,
He was Stalin when he died. They
oh yeah,
believed that Beria killed him because he was getting his next list together
yeah, oh yeah,
and purging all the top brass and
yeah. I
That's
mean,
cool.
there's a really awesome book called The Red Czar, and it talks about that whole time and the court around Stalin. But I
I
guess
should have been.
I
crafty
guess the
Georgian.
point is if you put yourself into Russia, into Soviet Union in 1949, would you go along or would you be as you are today? That's the question.
That's too many things to think about. If I had a family and they were holding my babies up, I would say, yeah, up to them.
Yeah, whatever. I mean, uh, and the same with the Germans, of course.
Yeah,
Once you're in a group and you're going along with the group, you
it would
know,
be tough. You'd have to.
it's hard to break out of it.
It's hard to just say, I'm ready to die, so you gotta do something.
Right. And
I don't know. I'm glad I didn't have to deal with that. The worst I had to deal with was a drought. So
yeah, well, I mean, that was bad enough,
yeah.
honestly. I mean, all of us were under the gun. You're going to Vietnam, guys, and too bad. And you can either go to college and sign up and be an officer, or you can go as a private.
And a lot of the officers were dropping dead at the second lieutenants were just
Yeah, second lieutenant's average life expectancy when the shooting started was 15 seconds, and that
I
was.
didn't want to go to officer school. I told them that.
Yeah,
They asked me a few times.
yeah. Well, um, somehow I survived it, but it
Yeah,
was.
congratulations. A lot of guys didn't.
Right.
A lot of them did. So.
Yeah, a lot of them did it. But my roommate at the basic school, we were in the basic school with Oliver North and Rich Higgins and Webby, Jim Webb, Senator Jim Webb, who later became Secretary of the Navy. He was in my basic class. Rich Higgins was the lieutenant colonel that was hanged in Lebanon in 1989 by Hezbollah.
Heard that was West Pointer. He was in Nam.
Really?
He was a Storm Norman buddy.
Uh-huh. So he was a contemporary of Schwarzkopf?
Well, so was, never mind.
Yeah. You don't have to unbutton for me on this. But, well, the Marine Corps was always good to me, okay? And so I have no complaints. I have no reasonable complaints. And, and I got 5 years of graduate school after my service, on GI Bill, so it was a good deal. Okay, number 6, the unconscious must be slowly integrated without violence and with due respect for our ethical values. This needs many alterations in our religious and philosophical views. I'll come back to that, but the West is forced to rearmament. We have to be ready for the worst. Europe must be organized by the USA, a travers, I'm sorry, my French is lousy, if need be, and it will be of vital importance to the USA, but no attack under no condition. Russia can only defeat herself. We cannot defeat our instincts, but they can inhibit each other, and they do if you allow them to run freely within certain limits, i.e., only so far as they don't just kill you. You shoot when you are threatened in your very existence, not when you are merely hurt in your feelings or in your traditional convictions. Now, I think that this really represents the position that the powers that be in Washington followed, actually, throughout the Cold War, which was to, hold off, don't attack the Soviet Union. Of course, Vietnam ended up being a hot battle in the Cold War, but we never used nuclear weapons. We never, tried to gin it up with Russia because of it, or with China. And, certainly I found equipment and medicines and things like that in Vietnam that had come from China, so we knew China was in it. But I think this is an important idea for us to understand now, because it's the fundamental issue of ISIS, which is, the Muslim world is really in terms of overall psychic development. I'm not talking about the intelligentsia. Okay, I'm not talking about the doctors and lawyers and politicians of the Muslim world, but I'm talking about average Muslims across the 350 million of them in the Arab world and 1.6 million of them globally. Many of them are still have mindsets that for us we passed in the 16th century. For example, in 1609, Galileo was forced to kneel before the Inquisition and swear on a Bible that the sun orbited the earth, and which he did with great flourish, and he knew that the Catholics were keeping good records, and he would make monkeys of them for the ages by doing that. The Abjuration of Galileo is one of the most interesting pieces of writing one ever hears. And so afterward, he wasn't allowed to look through a telescope. Of course, he had blinded himself by looking through a telescope at the sun, I think. So he probably couldn't have seen anything anyway. But he went on to invent two other sciences in the 4 years he lived after that. And so he was really a brilliant guy. But, and my ancestors came here to get away from the Catholic Inquisition and the Spanish coming up to Holland every year and beating the crap out of the Dutch because we wanted to be Calvinist. So, but we grew up over the next 200-300 years. We changed in our attitude about the world, and if we had. And so there was the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, and then things could develop in a more normal way. But what ISIS wants us to do is they want us to come to where they are in Syria with a big army, and they want to go down fighting because they know that if we do that, then we're going to make people angry in the Muslim world for the next century. People will be trying to get back at us, especially for all the non-combatants that we would kill, and so on. Everybody would be angry with us, and so we really have to be very careful and try to get Muslim armies to go in and take ISIS. It needs to be them, not us, because if it's us, then we're the enemy. And it needs to be Muslims themselves who realize this has to change, and that, since 9/11, mostly Muslims have died.
Well, that thing up above on 6, it says the unconscious must be slowly integrated without violence. And that's tough because you've got all those people violently having their unconscious form, which means there's no hope in a way for those. There's going to always be, and if that grows, it's just bigger and bigger that all their values are immersed, unconsciously propelled forward by all that violence. That there's nothing.
Right. And
there's.
You might have.
You can do about it.
Right. Well, that's right. You probably remember the movie Patton, where George C. Scott as Patton at the beginning gets up and he says, when you put your hand into a bunch of goo that a moment before was your best friend's face, you'll know what to do. Okay, well, he's right. And this is why when Dad came back from the war, he didn't really talk about it much. I don't know, does your dad talk about those things very much? No. And we run into it at hospice now because hospice runs a volunteer program where there's a final salute for veterans. And many of these guys have never said a thing about their military experience to their families. And, uh, you know, presumably it was because it was so horrific. And I mean, I have to presume that, having some of that experience. And and so, yes, you're right that if we create an awful thing, there'll be enough survivors who will go tell the story, and then there'll be plenty of angry people in the next generation who will come and try to bomb us wherever we are in the United
It's not
States.
something you can talk people out of because it's, it's embedded in,
Absolutely,
it's the seed
absolutely,
structure
right.
of everything.
Yeah, and you know, I don't myself. I don't. Um,
I mean, it happens everywhere, even like in the poor sections of Chicago.
oh, sure, it happens
it's all over the
everywhere.
place, but it's almost galvanized and organized, the hate and the violence.
Exactly, and but the only way humanity is going to survive is if we somehow get that sloshing back and forth of hatred and violence to stop, because you can get anybody to kill anybody under the under the right circumstances. There's no doubt about that, and um, and so and also what happens is people get stuck in this warrior archetype. They don't transform through the later phases, especially of adult manhood, where okay, you go through this warrior phase, and okay, I went in the Marine Corps, but other, you know, I had friends who went to Canada, and they were warriors in their own way because they had to be a warrior to fight the whole concept of what we were doing in this country at that time, and that was a kind of warrior too. And you know, those guys I really respect now, and very smart guys. Um, and so, uh, but but somehow, you know, I think I did develop beyond that warrior stage, and you know, okay, yeah, I did it for 23 years, um, but I didn't really feel like a warrior per se after I left active duty. Um, but a lot of my high school classmates who were Navy dependents with me over in Yokohama, um, you know, they all joined the Navy or some service, and they haven't changed. They're still warriors today, and you know, they're all going to vote for the people who want us to go to war with Iran. Uh, but
Well, you even see that warrior archetype in the business world.
oh, sure, yeah,
You know,
definitely,
kill the competition, be number one, be perfect.
absolutely, yeah. In fact,
It's just destructive.
right. In fact, Sun Tzu was, you know, this theorist like Machiavelli in China, right? And in the early 80s, when I was in Japan, Sun Tzu was extremely popular among Japanese businessmen. And so I actually took an English language translation of Sun Tzu, and which is called The Art of War. The book is called The Art of War, right? And I actually translated it into business language. I never did anything with that, but I actually wrote a book that was a translation of Sun Tzu into business language. And so, you know, I know a lot of businessmen today who you know, read and study and carefully follow Sun Tzu and Machiavelli and those guys, and you know, there's something to it in the business world. You need strategies like that to
I mean,
sometimes.
they had the Genghis Khan book, didn't they?
Oh yeah.
God
Yeah.
knows what else.
But what I'm talking about is people who don't psychologically transform into the next stage of human existence that they should be, which is, they should be developing into the mature man, that's called the king, but it's, the king of the castle, the king of the family. And so the mature man is raising a family and, getting the kids to college and all that. That's the next stage. And then it's the old man, the wise old man or the wise old woman, Hecate. Um, that's the phase for women. And but so many of these guys who have been in battle never get there. Okay, they just go home. They can't talk to their spouses about what they saw because it was so horrific. They can't really express it. Maybe if they had a lot of therapy, they could express it, but they can't. And so what do? They end up being warriors sitting in an armchair watching the National Football League, okay, and doing it vicariously. And I don't know, did any of you see the movie Concussion that Will Smith did? Oh my heavens.
Yeah, with the football injuries, yeah.
Right, and this doctor, this Nigerian doctor, he came to the U.S. and the only job he could get was as a pathologist in the morgue in Pittsburgh, and so all of a sudden, there came a time when these NFL players were showing up dead in his morgue, and he did very careful autopsies on them and found that they had severe brain damage from playing football for 20 years or whatever it was, 10 to 15 years, I guess most of these guys do, and so ultimately, I think the NFL got sued by like 5,500 players and had to settle for a big number because of that. But the story is about what he went through when he was first trying to bring it out, and everybody was in denial. Nobody wanted to admit that there was any problem. This is an organization that owns a day of the week. It used to be owned by the church, but now it's owned by the NFL. That's the way that.
Was Will Smith the coroner?
Yeah, he plays the coroner. I think if he had been an American, he probably would have been put off bringing it to anybody's attention because they just said, you're unpatriotic if you bring this stuff up. This is Americana.
A lot of money at stake.
Yeah, all this money. That's right. It's all this money, and it's what everybody does. You can't change this, and so now I think they do have rules that they're not allowed to bang heads, and I think they've changed the helmets as well because of that. But still, I'm sure there's a lot of risk. But I know even for me, I have a very, very mild case of PTSD. I never had any therapy about it, but I was certainly in places where I heard a lot of gunfire and cannon fire and so on, and there were certainly a lot of helicopters around. And today, every time a helicopter flies over me, I'm back in Vietnam every time. And every time I go to the fireworks, I can't watch fireworks except on television anymore because I get so pent up. And, I had no idea this was happening to me. And when I first came back, my then father-in-law had a boat on the Niagara River, and he took me out on this boat on the 4th of July. And all of a sudden the fireworks display started up, and man, I almost jumped out of the boat. And I said, whoa, where'd that come from?
Is that PTSD then, that reaction?
Yeah, I think it is. And and it's very mild. Okay, it doesn't bother me any other time except when at fireworks displays and when I hear a helicopter going over. But definitely it's there, and so I know from my own experience that if that's how I'm reacting to something as simple as that, then guys who are really in the fighting, I was in a couple of battles, but nothing like the infantry was. And pardon? And like your dad, I'm sure. Yeah. Was he an infantry officer? Oh boy. Yeah. So, is he still alive? Is your dad? No. Okay. Um,
No, he retired. He was a lawyer after he retired.
oh, was he?
He retired as colonel.
Good for him. I mean, as an American, I have to say, good for him. But on the other hand, uh, I know how an infantry officer in the Army would have suffered. Okay, and when you think of battles like Way and Khe Sanh and those battles, oh my heavens, I was just lucky to come along when the war was really over. I was in, there was still a little fighting going on, but nothing.
He was on the front end of it.
Yeah, I'm sure. And so if we know that about ourselves, okay, that's what happens to us, you can imagine what it must be like for Muslims in Iraq. Well, the mistake that we made in 2003 when we went into Iraq was the idea that we could superimpose democracy on a society that's really 400 or 500 years behind us in terms of psychological development, I believe, okay? And so, they were acculturated over many years. There's Sunnis and the Shia in Baghdad, got along. They built up a culture where they got along, they intermarried, and so on. But when we came in and broke that culture, then we started 4 wars. Basically, there were 4 wars going on in Iraq. And there was a civil war, and there was the Sunni Shiite war, and there was the U.S. war against whatever, and so we broke that pot, and we probably shouldn't have. Okay.
Why did they hire a few anthropologists before they did this? I mean, that's what they did in World War II when they invaded Japan.
I remind you that George W. Bush was president of the United States.
Enough said.
Huh? Enough said.
The other thing, though, is when you're saying it's 400 or 500 years ago, I'm wondering if that's really the case. I'm thinking it's just there's an alternative social structure and political structure in place, and they've got their problems, and they got their pluses and their minuses, just like democracies do.
Right.
And even though we live, for the most part, at least in name, in the democracies, there's a lot of pluses and minuses.
Surely.
So I don't know if we didn't just go in and try to put our pluses and minuses on these people, and they said no way, rather than going back 500 years or something, because I'm not so sure that, it's like any culture is going to
Okay, I agree. I'm overstating it. Okay, I agree. I'm overstating it.
Okay.
And people have their cultures, but what Dr. Jung was talking about was that even our Western structures have broken down in the 20th century and the late 19th century, and you hear that. I'm currently reading on audio Nietzsche's book called Beyond Good and Evil, and it's have you read it?
A long time ago. Not all of it, actually. I only read
Yeah, I mean, it's very, you can get lost in a sentence in that book. But basically he was sort of predicting the end of our psychic reliance on the church, among other things, and on the social structures that have been built up in Germany, especially. He was talking about up until 1875, or 1885, maybe. That's when that book was published, um, and so he was kind of predicting that there would be a sort of a breakdown of the European psyche, which in fact happened twice. Okay, and and that's what World Wars One and Two were, is partially because of that. And I think a lot of Europeans that are older, probably people our age, don't even know this, but people that were our parents' age, um, they've felt that we've had to completely redevelop Europe. Um, Basically, after World War II, it had to be. I mean, and I mean more than just rebuilding Dresden. I mean, uh, just the interrelationship of people has taken years and years to restructure in some way that loosely works. And actually, Jung talks about it here. So let me let me go back to this letter. Let me.